Vitaly, friends, I am Vitaly Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk about the fact that the undermining of the slime track about the Polish voivodeship was a diversion. I was so afraid of Poland. We perfectly understand the sense of sabotage. Tied up with Namagani on the Skoda climbing infrastructure itself all over Ukraine, the scrolls are valid until the help of Ukraine. According to the Skoda of this infrastructure, and the girlfriend of the sunsets are Poles. They can still normally see that you are Tilki in order for me to stop helping neighboring Ukraine. And Tilki for that I'm not going to climb theirs, the installers are helping the Ukrainian armies of the Russian occupiers. Chilnik of the General Staff of the Army of the Polish General or Kukul, calling the fact that you are in his Ukraine today in front of the military camp. And I demand to say another thing from General Wisław Kukula's son. He has grown overgrown from the statement of the Minister of Defense with the PITA he received in the state. This is the Minister of War with the jealousy received in the state in today's article at Sweetie. And with 1939th, and in the general understanding, with 1983rd rock. It's so rich that in the West, the idea of really preparing for guilt is respected. It's getting worse, you and I are overgrown for threats. And what we want for the guilt, and we are for it is true, but the claims for the recently gone Spilny for the Russian Federation. Yaki the entire administration of Donald Trump. General Kokola Ors. So tell Prot that in the end des finds in Poland in the 1939th kind. In the 1900 Desayat Persh. Peak cold guilt favor. And the 39th for Poland and the powers. The sunsets of the ranks of PAK will memorize it to aggression. And in order for Kotoworoga, it is necessary to hand over the defense from Poland, and let me help Ukraine. Recently, the General Staff of the Polish Army, having made a statement. The claims are tied up, and so-called Nagnichivani, and another one is frequent on the hybrid guilt of Russia against Poland. And against Ukraine in the additional speech of the General Staff of the Polish Vyska Army, awakening the atmosphere of sorcery, still anti-Ukrainian in the ranks. They themselves and Poland are tied up and magnified, the gates and the plenty of the UMAVs, so that Poland stops helping Ukraine. So that the very reality of Ukrainian refugees in Poland is accepted as an object of the threat. Polish and not Russia's fault against Ukraine, not Russia's fault against Poland. And in order for Russia to solve the problem of Ukraine, and the cob of a new Rivnya Taisku in neighboring Ukraine. Ukraine of Central Europe. At the moment I picked up the role and the victim, I was clear. The aggressor at the gathering, in other words Russia. Declare the Polish General Staff. Why am I so wrapped up your vag on those Polish shades of the fact that, well, it's possible that Poland itself has become Ukraine. The century flew, and already a good bucket. We will catch the drone army with you on the territory of Poland, on the territory of Belgium, and on the territory of European Ukraine. And it was possible to talk and walk there in full view of drones, Vitaly on the lead scrolls, hiccuped on the lead century strained. And after the food, the most Russian drones obviously flew into Ukraine, and giving birth to what was from the sample and about the dropout attacks. Well, with me hybrid and psychologically. And on the president himself, with the information received in the state, I'm talking about the fallout with such an attack. We are still bashing on the truth of the whole attack of the Bula. And it is also obvious that it was planned by the Russian political. And it is obvious that the attack is so that otherwise it is not enough for us to go, the yak is put in Poland. I put in the European Ukrainians to the extent of scaling up the conflict. I'm talking about there is such a scaling, as you know. And the prices, I would say simply, we are with you, of course, a real speech. So you cannot get its economical potential to enter yet in Shvidko, and Russia's guilt against Ukraine is sewn up. And at a time, everything to get Shvidkov. And the rest of the sanctions for the rights with the states obtained against the Russian Federation, for the Crimea. Sanctions against the NAFTA giants, Lukoil and Rosneft. And Razmo about the fact that American congressmen can praise such a bill to create sanctions strikes on Ukraine. Yet continue the plate economically shot down for the Russian Federation. And the discussion on how to continue about the European Union even before the confiscation of Russian assets. After all, Crocs for knitting with magnetization of yak on Shvidj add to Russia and economical potential, and I will accept. And with it not about the fire on the Russian-Ukrainian front. The obvious American President Donald Trump kind of Bataga policy, the kind of carrot policy, is Bataga policy. Before the policy of Taisku on the Russian Federation. And this is our side. Chess. And now what was the problem with the Russian Federation? It was so numb that the guilt was sewn up on the seams, and on the Russian minds, the liquidation of the Ukrainian state. And the cob of the process can be seen of the Russian imperial state at the cordon of the Radian Union. And of course, we understand perfectly well that Putin does not want the Russian power to stick out its economic potential. And the necessary one and the same for the Zalukavani of the pegged Radian republics and for their liquidation. Not from Moscow's point of view of pseudo-power, not because the blame for Ukraine and for the Rada Tilka of Ukraine. Ukraine is the key to the slaughter of all peoples. They managed to get out of the imperial paste in 1991. And gone. And I to Russia in those situations extracted Shvidkov, Zakinchnoi, blame on the authorities. But there are no economical sanctions against Russia. You didn't call Russia for auto-potential. You didn't call Russia for auto-cutting. I will help Ukraine, but Russia. Russia, however, cannot impose these sanctions against Ukraine's enviable Zatakala. And Russia, she herself is going to engage in her own fishing complex, then even those of Ukraine, yes. Helps about hiring and from the promos. It is possible to significantly change the situation in the topic of the whiskey fishing complex. But she loves to help Russia illegally so as not to run into Western sanctions. I am my People's Republic of China. But legally it still can't help so much, because you help often on your sovereign budget. So I'm some kind of visible types of mystery. Scaling of guilt. The scaling of guilt can be in absolutely obvious categories. About the look of hybrid guilt, I have already started to cry. I'm going to BAM. On the Cobb. There were drones. For the collapse of the sabotage on Zalesny. Then on the spring in Europe, there will be Tilky on Rosta. I'm in the keel of the commission in that apparatus. We do not tell you about the fact that as a result of the know-how of an armed object on the territory, drones can be launched from the territory. Such a franchise. I say, maybe the Ukrainians are against the Russians in an extremely fast situation. Or maybe the Russians are against the Ukrainian army itself, or Ukraine's allies in Europe. Extremely in Europe on the received states, and know-how and just to twist the Russians. So that we tell him there to show the lawlessness and helplessness of entering the Russian Federation. And so again, we're also talking about slurring the entrance. The Shlyak of scaling up the conflict may be that I will attack the wrong people of the apocalyptic picture of Russia on Europe, at the wrong stage of the conflict. I think that the beating of a nuclear conflict is both direct with a nuclear power and with the received states from France and Britain. And Russia is the kind of such, and I admit, and this is absolutely real speech, that in those situations a cut can be thrust. For a special hybrid guilt on us, for a special hybrid guilt can already be really taken away with you. Drones can appear in the simplicity of Ukraine has already been declared on a one-time frequent on Vienna. And you can already talk about the military camp. And maybe reconnaissance drones at the moment, the shock drones of Moscow's involvement are no longer called, it can strike at those objects. And, let's say, it stands up for yes, I will help Ukraine. Absolutely the same real roses go to the offensive dust. And you can talk. And Poland is such a testing ground for trying out such moments. A friend is often at the hybrid fault of sabotage of construction on the territory of Belarus, Ukraine, their agents. And there will be Pedvedi infrastructure facilities and Shlyak Zaleznikny with this problem on automobile gentry. I respect the absolutely obvious frequency on such hybrid guilt and about cordon points. Then political instruments can simply be a cordon of Ukraine, and he is such a rank in Ukraine. We Bachil even those Zabs have already bolted. The third element of sabotage may be political, and may be tied up, and the Zak of the Russian population. That there may be serious problems for the Baltic. I'm already saying, it doesn't give up on those airwaves that we don't say, look at the political situation in the Baltic Ukraine. For the results of municipal elections in history. And the results are not that I am ready to do anything. Let's say this in Narva, there is a block tied up firm obviously for me to the pro-Russian politicians of Strelnukin. I turned off my watch firm the centrist party for NATO, I would say, intensively knocked down with Russian political stakes. And for the Russian political narrative in Estonian. And I'm all on the fringe. With us in the mines of Narva and the region in Russian. And I will not be ethnically Russian, this is the term for Russian at this time. Russian on Stolnukin looking marginal. May the bloc, may not, and supposedly of course, even on a well-fed political pro-Baltic Ukraine with such a Stolnukin. Then the PPR may look like a marginal, and people will come saboteurs like this. I am now Russia was elected to conduct a hybrid war from Ukraine. And at the stage in the 2014 lesson, there was the most hybrid wine. With the cob, so the title in the Hall of the Little Men in the Crimea in order to. Yak we are with you, of course, the occupation of the annexation of the island. And for a long time, Russia did not recognize the fact that it was not up to the Russian services in Crimea to occupy the annexation of the territory and sweat what was called a clear Russian term, pour gasoline. Saboteurs on the territory of Donbass. Odin, Kharkovshan. With a sample of the gates in all territories, so the titles of the People's Republic would still be the mats of the platform for the appearance of Russian visas, therefore the prohania of the Lord of the Pseudo-Republic. Well, I was on the territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The apparatus, in principle, ended with success, and the organizers about us are frequent on the territory of these regions. Already in the 2014 kind, it passed under the control of Russia, became a springboard for attacking the inch territory of Ukraine. In fact, this is an absolutely tested scenario. I do not respect that the Russians will still benefit. Or maybe, in principle, you are already a driven scenario, in order to be seen. In order to create a real one to destabilize the situation near the armed edges. It does not matter how often the fault is, there will be elements of a deposit. Russian political scientist Sergei Karaganov respects those close to the Kremlin. That's literally the Sprat is wrong in an interview in one of the German right-wing populist issue. So-called anti-globalists. I say again that respectfully Russia may launch a nuclear strike on Europe. You also see a kind of Russophobic nastas, and not here is such a recommendation. In the repetition and clearly pro-Yak Maya beauty, the situation is formed in order for the Pole to return to Russia again. The European population in spent fear of guilt, especially nuclear. For the irony of the share and the fear was a stabilizing factor against the remains. We will cope with the absolutely boss-hevel people of Karaganov. In Europe, the European elite in the stakes of some per departure will impose a dominant. It has become degenerative in rich Ukrainians with meat and hyenas and for not being the heirs of their idea. Then the dialogue is not allegedly Europe Maya before the war. And I respect that the wine is also economically carried out about us and on it by the temples and for the military. And strikes are needed at the station. The scale and nature of the blows in May. The bottle is seriously examined by a specific skin dropout. Confiscation of billions of Russian assets. I am also in demand for banditry and so on, up to 1 million axis in Europe. And a harsh ultimatum for ultimatum visits and extortion of such. All the temple conflicts in Ukraine have been completely washed away, and our sovereign resources are completely and insanely overloaded. Here is Karagan for you. Well, even before Ukraine itself, the Cornish was often called Ukraine. It became frequent in the Russian Federation. Throughout the territory, it turned out as if a zone had been created, denazified, demilitarized, control over this zone, extorting a neutral contingent of peacekeeping forces for these Tiki forces beyond the Asian-African edges. In addition, an unmanned zone is needed, so that not bright unmanned ones could not fly in. You are in the buffer, Mish, Russia is still a bucket, and Europe is still being laid out, and Russia is a Eurasian Ukraine. Our European Padash, Yaka continued Tristicha was for NATO, and complete it, and I propanel and hours before the war. And the destruction of Europe. Why do I have to read everything for so long? Well, so that there are no illusions that the Russian is politically looking at the plans of the temple strikes on European Ukraine at times. The economic lawsuit against Russia will continue further. There is still no way out of the situation in I am Russia. I am not scaling the blame. No one is crying in Moscow. And parades of such people I Karaganov declare in Putin that, in Putin's comrades that I am important. are frequent in the Russian political discourse. Girlfriend, as I have already said, that no one had no eye to the sum. And that in Russia no one sees on the most it is possible to withdraw from the Ukrainian power to the political retinue of the Yak Pact. In Russia, they are still frequent on the territory of Ukraine, and I will come. And they are frequent on the territory of Ukraine pretending to be a protector. Russia does not enter. The protectors will be occupied from the west by the friendly, and up to the Russian army of Ukraine, and will be planted throughout Russia in the Russian order. And the third, the fact that I'm on the wall, Nagata and Tesh do not take adequately. Putin is acting in praise of the decision about a complete change of the orientation vector of Russia. David will act in Persia for 300 Rocky. Trebo, of course, Russia before Peter Posh was not called her empire. The girlfriend was a Eurasian power with a direct-to-a-skid. The power I Kamala on richly bilsh lime in the outcome of not calling. The power of Yako grew from the Golden Horde to the colony of the protector of the Golden Horde. And I was mentally Asian in fact. We're laughing at Peter Persh there. I'm going to take my boyers for well-fed European camisoles and naked beards. And the same thing I will be on the site of the 20th of Mustafa and Kamali Mataturk, and I will be to us in European Ukraine. A gentleman of the tradition of the Ottoman Empire, Tilka Mustafa Enamel Van, and economically and politically became European. And the Emperor Petro Pershiva, and so that Russia became European, turned off envied from the point of view of the Lime Showcase. So it's overgrown. And in fact, in Moscow they find out that he sent to the European Empire in Russia, in his wife exuding. Now Europe has all the arguments rolled up to that not yet ostensibly sensu, orientation to Europe, and Zak for Russia Bilshi on Maya. Russia is also my stats Eurasian, then Asian power, Zaryovanu on China. Both mine, and their loom ideologically platform, as it is voiced here. And Nicola, as you know, there has never been a situation of a power in the history of Russia. Now the Romanovs. Now I have unraveled the tide on me, and well, into the chat in Chinese. I'm Donka Paul in the Chinese mainstream. Then you think more Russians are ready? Yes, you absolutely are. And the president did not respect Nikola Chinsky as a priority. And for otherwise. And extremely such a Russia direct SB, to the Chinese partner and the Chinese province. She can respect absolutely calmly fight from Europe. They will also put, I do not write often on the European Crimea, under the control of the Chinese-Russian PC. And Yak proxy links to China. Because I'm still talking, and really Putin is pretending in Russia for such a proxy. And again, this is how I will unravel the rock process. God can give up just me. I profit from an imperious head. And you are a discount in the water hall on your man. In Moscow, let's say. I am the rumor of Sergei Karagin. And now public speaking. And now I'm there for conferences, and Zach for these conferences. And I've already made it absolutely clear to you. Still, the whole position she had of the senior day would simply have been won. Maybe I quote the written text. And I'm a good one. The meeting of the Rada of the Foreign Defense Policy of Russia in 1992 in the People. Maybe I remind you of the exact dates on the COB 90 at a time. At the requests of the Ukrainian delegation to talk about the Russian-Ukrainian 100 bags and a sickly Persian intercessor, the Minister of Transcordial Affairs of Russia Anatoly Adamish came to the podium. They died a long time ago. And Kerrigan, I say with my head, she is welcome on foreign defense policy. I tried to get to Mission I'm Quinn to pump rose bags between Russia and Ukraine. Yak my Russia puts up to Ukraine. And this is Mishina, diplomats have been highlighted, a new career, and the Ministry of the Transcordonian Union. And the Ministry of Russia, that something like began. Having said, I respect still need from Ukraine, I am an extremely independent power. And you haven't started yet. And I'm all in the guise of Kerrigan. Tom does not need to think about the massacre of Karaganov there. Rez Navalok became a conjuncturist of what Putin's position. Vlada's position has become. Neither Putin has become a hand tool of his chauvinistic tightness in the hands of the Karaganovs. That's what's real. And Ibach can still sprat Razi already talk about a nuclear strike on Europe. To overestimate in the Russian public you will simply be shunned by experts last week before the Kremlin, then this definitely means that you will see one with the concept within the framework of the Russian-Ukrainian rose. The chief of the general staff of the Polish army, the Polish troops are absolutely right. The war period and the careless war period, I just need to notify. And the Polish general reaction. As a result, I will be jealous of democratic Ukraine for the threat to lay their survival, and our survival, of course. On Stampor today is our survival, and already on the survival of those who help us. There you go. This is such a reaction to the fact that you are scaling the blame for the injection. I ask you to subscribe to the channel of those who are not subscribed. I guess that we have completed less than 25,000 to 1 million. And you can take the fate of the challenges will be taken by the skin who signs up today and brings us up to the figure. Put it in a similar way, to whom else you will invent about the inventory, and with the channel tools. I am torturing the ether. And I respect Pan Vitaly, the European visual democracy at the speech, and the bizarre of the scoop of the body of lighthouses. You can ask a new Hitler. Well, at the same time, I'm shoveling the bodies of lighthouses. You can ask a new Hitler really at this stage, although you don't know yet that I'm going to develop the international situation in Stalin was not going to throw both the bodies and the imperious soldiers. Hitler was going to throw in the bodies and soldiers of the Zahid democracy, and he in it I came out. So that it does not become so offensive to throw Russian bodies and the Chinese. Maybe it's still a year away, believe me. On the heads of technology. I Zegoli don't think that our head sprats with the population in Ukraine, I Zegoli. I think that the Russian-Ukrainian wine is the wine of the 20th. And then there will be robots, veins of technology, veins of saboteurs in peace intelligence, and a bolt of manpower. That is in millions of people. We will become the words of the rose for some technical progress. Well, who will not? What you and I can send up the hill with 1,000,000. And in order not to remain, it is necessary to go uphill, and, of course, such Zagros. It's been a very rich hour since Shahid flew into Poland, and since that hour there hasn't been such a rich continuation about the sleeve. Why has Russia put so many ideas on pause in your thinking? I don't respect that it wasn't continued. There were elements of such drones in the rich Ukrainians of Europe with paralysis in the wind. We are still sabotaging, and with a bump, and did not climb. Russia is engaged in point diversions. There was a check, yak to the enemy in western Ukraine, NATO, and the rubble on the side of Russia. I also want to know why Russia has put on pause the flights of its drones into the territory of Poland and Ukraine. I can tell you what. To the fact that the buckets of reason have passed the lines of the cutting zone for windy control over the western regions of Ukraine, and the Shidny and Voivodeship and Poland. It's unclear what Russia was not numb in. And in Moscow, perfectly well, the provocation of such a shti will continue and of such a scale itself. On the Polish member of the Romanian territory, they will be for such a zone, maybe a material initiative from Moscow. And then it is necessary to add to the fact that Russia clearly did not flow into the territory of western Ukraine, in the alignment of the no-fly zone. That's why I have no reaction in western Ukraine and at the dark stage on the apparatus. I continued about the fact that I would accept the pravity for the obvious threat to Russia, and decided to explain the logic of Corbyn. The truth is not clear, even after having forgotten Ukraine, the reset and the dates of Russia are waived. It can be seen that the Russian Empire has already been studied and loaded. Norman may not really be the leader, because it goes out of logic that Russia is not a weak power, it cannot fight for Ukraine either. And Chipseva was absolutely unreasonable, she can go to NATO for a beard. I think it is absolutely clear that Russia clearly does not respect that in order for it to calm down. It needs a kind and a peg republic for the sake of their kind, and calmly gave a plate from Russia. It can also be an engagement position. And the idea is that Viktor Orban can still advise Russia on the topic. He has the understanding that the adoration of Russia can be seen in his zone by swimming into Ukraine. Form a political map of the retinue. In Central Europe, the cleaners obviously come in. So here I do not understand at the expense of you respect another skin politician with this so strategically thinks. For Orban, in his cheaper Russian on the foundation and corruption in the cleaning, and social stability in the cleaning, it is not as real as the situation with the wiring of the Maybit urban regime. Thinks tactfully. Russia also spends on the autogas market and apparently access to free pennies than production can. Before democratization in a string perspective, I do not know what kind of social instability in Russia can affect before the democratization of the new brutal regime. And just to solve the problems of Ukraine itself. Of course, the whole problem is that in Russia, for the 1917th lesson, the dispersal of the demonstration of Russian choppers on Kiev in Petrograd. On the ZAK, the installer is assembled. Nikola did not have democracy, and as the most popular was elected in those Russian times. The results of democracy were actually taken down by the Bolsheviks, and I think we are on the scale, because we know on Ukrainian soil. And we do not reveal the scale on Russian, so to speak. in Russian schools and read there the Yaroslavl massacre, the Yaroslavl mutiny. This is called such a term. Pro and Bolsheviks. There's Yaroslav, who is not a Russian from Kamala. Well, just get out of we all know about there I'm Frankists Bombili. Barcelona, Chegarnik, Slitaki. And no one knows that the Russian Bolsheviks simply have a huge Yaroslavich in his place, absolutely less space. Well, there the cathedrals ended sounding. One of the beautiful buts in our misunderstanding in the scale of the support and the fact that I got it. So, all over Russia, of course you have also one in Hromadyadsky guilt. It's grand there. History. A puff of wine looking for people and places. And firm that our cola in Russia was from a sample of democracy, it was democracy from the mountain. The Russians have lived up to the core, now to the Soviet Union, and to Mikhail Gorbachev, for giving us rights. I'm going to the Tsar. Thank you, Mikhail Sergeyevich, for giving us and driving Wilno. And still wouldn't have given. And then there would be Gorbachev and Grigory Roman. Of course, that's why Nikola's Russia has not had a real revolution from below since the 1917th lesson. The 18th. Trying to get discounts for Russian elites will still be a problem with social stability under democracy itself. Clearly on trial. What the president enclave sanctions on Minda man on and what it means I'm a little like the law. I was in a tan to say that Ukraine cannot impose sanctions against the Ukrainian Rodians behind the law. And this is the decline of the galoshes of foreigners for the wires of sanctions. I do not know what this means, and of course, I am the rank of TPPR Ukraine. We are extorting the powers of Israel. The extradition of the powers of Israel is not imperious. And I will make out the legal speech. Copper, let's say they're on pain that they will give out those in Ukraine. And Ukraine, for example, with the received states, Israel can be richly harshly extorted below Ukraine. The Jewish state. Well, it can be seen, for example, that you give out discounts for the retinue to the Americans Firtash. I'm not going to lose, but we're not giving up. I'm not like extradition and these processes. So this is a serious story. I am not, of course, we are such a rank, I managed to get into tech. Why do we accept the unfortunate foreigner? It's very clear that it's just a friend of his passport. Reduced his Ukrainian gromadyanstvo and things. Whose understanding of Poland do we have of what is visible to Russia, allegedly, and the reasons themselves are aggressive? It is clear that up to Poland. But I still think differently. On the stage of Poland, and you are still overgrown, you have turned into, say, Brown's party, into an anti-Ukrainian, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, and, in fact, pro-Russian behind the spirit. I would say not a careless situation, and not a reception. I think you are all well aware of this. So the torture for torture is that the yak is at the forefront of the political elites. You are also sweeping out Polish President Andrzej Duda. I'm going to jail for the law and justice parties. Jaroslaw Kaczynski's party. Kaczynski on the Maidan at 2014. But the passages to Kiev are now to blame. Boof by a friend in Ukraine and lobbyists of NATO interests before Trump, the Polish ambassador to Kiev, Bartosz Tichocki, was actually working for diplomats, and then he got drunk in Nikol and loaded Kiev with the Russian occupation. And PPR, the new president of Poland, Law and Justice, Karl Nawrocki, does not seem to be elected until Kiev. And I say that even before Warsaw. You pass, there would be an absolutely logical crock in Ukraine. Yakov would load fatally not at times the success of Russia in Ukraine. Everything is fine, of course, that no one will give a zloty for Poland. Is it possible, Counselor, that the Americans will fight for the Poles? They won't. So what if they won't? It's a good torture. There are secondary retrospectives. Kola Poles and Ukrainians, Lithuanians and Crimean Tatars. I'm a 100-year-old begging in Russia. Nevertheless, the verified history should be checked again. So Putin will be tricked by the right-wing populist party of Europe. He will change the light order to the Asian one. What are the chances of such a scenario? Diakuyu? Well, on the ticks of the right-wing populace and the straight of populace. I don't think it's necessary to change the legal order to the Asian one. And the truth is that Putin is on the field of missile defense, on the serpentine political landscape of Europe. And I said that on the topic of Shirak, Hromadyan guilt in Syria. There was honestly a sprat of Syrian refugees. I'm you in Europe. And it turns out that she was doing a serious analysis of the adoption of migration policy in the West. The shopping center for the sum spent up to serious problems with the adoption of traditional political parties. I am conservatives, and so is social democracy. And at the same time, we are bashing Europe in the position of the right of populace with a skin day. Happy Skin Day. And there is still no doubt that the conservatives of Petra received their right-wing populace from the United States of America. Trumpist. Here is the alternative party for not kicked out of all the right-wing factions in the European Parliament. The Prime Minister of Bavaria, Markus Zeder, and took into account one of the right-wing political parties. In do not let the right conservative Christian social union ideas happen on the territory. Calling them Putin's Pozupak. Those people reached the Russian embassy. And I'm going to decompose to Washington on the requested Republicans. That's what he is extremely with the course of Russian-Ukrainian guilt, and overgrowing into non-Europeans by tomorrow, the West may also be. The European one has a choice for such a political force. Yaka will be able to work with Putin. Not in order to become the Asian order in Europe, but in order to respect the Asian order with Y. I was in Europe in the 30th hand of the 20th century. The new order Ordnu, Hitler's order, and Mussolini. My wife had democratic Ukraine in Europe. The fact that there may be a European order in Europe, just an order similar to the 30/20th. And of the very order of the idol Putin. And he himself is important in the topic of all the hoops, and to mark another strength, I am the city of democracy. I am the conspiracy of Kukula, the chief of the general staff of the Polish Wojska, in his pre-war situations. And those who think that it is possible to overwhelm authoritarianism. So no one goes anywhere. will become for authoritarianism, types of Hitler's authoritarianism. This produced a lot of guilt in Europe in the 20th. I'm telling those who were on the air. I'm going to ask you to subscribe to the channel again. I'll tell you that you and I have reasonably extracted 1 million on the topic of the channel. So sign it, I'll be happy. Put serve, command. Choked past is so well known. With the tools of the channel and help the Ukrainian army. I am also the Ukrainian army's head guarantor of the preservation of Ukrainian sovereignty in the offensive on the Sari. So yes, the parried fees help, including on my old-fashioned social boundaries. And I adore you. Have a good evening. It is also important in our, and